Hello everyone, welcome. Today we're going to be continuing our castle series with the fantasy battle map style. Today we're going to be covering Roman forts. It's for those of you who maybe have an alternative Roman history campaign, or you just like the design of a Roman fort and you want to integrate it into your campaign, or if you just want a big ass battle map that you could use for a siege. So all of that is what you're looking for, then stick around for this stream. Now, if you want to clone and edit this map to follow along, then go ahead and direct yourself over to the chat. You'll see that I provided that link. So definitely click, clone, and follow along. Let's not waste any time. Let's just jump right in, okay? So with Romans, just like any empire, whenever you're an imposing or an invading force, you want to have a military presence, and a fort is what you have, right? You need a fort to house military personnel, commanders, chefs, whatever entourage is coming with those soldiers. So it's always good to have a fort when you're invading, or if it's along your own borders. It's a great defensive position. So let's go ahead and jump in. Whenever I get started with a map, I always like to first have a little bit of a process, because without a process, you kind of get lost in the sauce a little bit as you're putting together the map. A process will help you to stay focused, keeps you point by point, and the beautiful thing about a process is you don't have to follow it from A to Z or 1 to 9. You can always go back. You can start one part of the process, skip over one, then go to the next one, whatever you want. So a process is helpful. The first step in my process, outside of the pre-development, that means planning, maybe having some image references, I like to set a scale. Okay, now in Inkarnate, the way you set your scale is with the grid. You'll see that I have a grid on, and this grid is actually massive. This is 111 columns by 80 rows, which means that it's 200 or 450 feet by 400 feet. And you're asking yourself, Maddie, why do you need such a massive battle map? Well, I'm going to tell you right now, a massive battle map is absolutely fabulous because you can use the resize tool to resize certain sections of the map. A large battle map also allows for more playability, as the players might not be able to explore the entire map. Lots of good reasons why you would want to make a massive battle map, because you can actually get like a dozen smaller battle maps from one large one with the resize tool. And you can actually find that in the grid. Right here, it'll say resize from new region. Click, hold, and drag, and then you can move that box around and just resize. And what will happen is that once you press confirm, it will make a new map from that boxed area. So resize feature, chef's kiss, is a must, okay? So reasons for big battle maps, there's your reason. So now once you have the grid on, then you'll set each little grid is going to be 5 square feet. So like I said, massive battle map, 450 feet by 400 square feet. Okay, hey, first time chatter, welcome. So glad that you are here. So now that we've set our scale, that's going to help us knowing like how big something is, distances and stuff like that. So nice to have that scale. The next step in that process is to work with a sketch. So let's go ahead and delete that real quick, and we'll jump over back into process. Okay. There we go. So next is to use a sketch. Now, if you're not familiar with the path tool, it is absolutely fantastic for doing a simple sketch. You don't need a pen to do a sketch. You can totally use a mouse. It's fine, because a sketch is just a rough draft. It's just there to give you something to work against or on top of, so that way you're not just working from scratch. A sketch is super helpful. Reference image, whatever it is you need to help you, because without some kind of reference, it's really hard to get the map started, okay? So let's jump into that sketch. And one of the first things we'll do with the sketch is we want to sketch out our terrain. Now, when it comes to terrain, especially with military, forts, castles, anything like that, you're going to want to build it on maybe some steep terrain, whether you're going to dig some ditches around the fort or the castle so that there's some strong ditches, or you want to have a really tall up in a mountain or on top of a hill. Those kind of things are going to be really important. High up, natural defenses, water act as natural defenses. So high up is good. So first, let's just explain a little bit what you see with my sketch. These points right here, this one right here, this one right here, and this one right here. These are all going to be the highest points, or second to the highest points, and I'm going to put my fort actually right here. This is where my fort's going to be. Nice big tall section, and I'm also going to have this be down here a swamp. And I want that to be a swamp because remember I mentioned water is a natural defense. No army would ever try to mobilize in a swamp because it's just a disaster for logistics and mobilizing troops. So putting a swamp a little bit in the southern part is a great natural defense as well. Water, mountain, hills, all that stuff is important when you're factoring in your terrain for your military structures, okay? So now that we know a little bit about my terrain, now we can go ahead and put down the structures. I made the same structures with the path tool, not complex, and I just put them in red. This is going to be our Roman fort. And you'll notice there's a section over here on the right side where there's kind of a dashed line. That's where my interiors are going to be. Now, when you first make the map, you don't have to worry about factoring in where the interior part is. You'll just resize it and then make some room up on either side of the map to just paint that black, and then you'll put your interiors on that side. Because if you're running in a VTT, you know, you can't, there's no way to show the exterior and a transfer over to an interior back and forth like that. So putting your interiors off to the side of the map or even saving it for a little bit later works out great. So resize it later and then you can work on the interiors. Now, next in that step, of course, I want to also mark my access. Now, access means like, are there bridges? Are there gates for like a gatehouse? Are there roads? All those things right there are going to determine the access, okay? You'll notice that I've got some yellow structures right here. Those little lines right there represent where my gates are going to be, okay? So the roads are going to lead into the gate like this. This is kind of how a Roman fort was built. It had a rectangular shape. Inside had the structures that held the military personnel and whatever was with that retinue. And then, of course, there was a gate on either side of the rectangle to let troops in. These were all well fortified. Now, once we put all that together, now we kind of know the general layout. So I'll go ahead now, and I want to keep this sketch on, but I'm going to drop the opacity a little bit because I want to be able to see some of the sketch beneath so that I can work on top of it. Okay, so once you have the sketch, you group everything and then just select the group, relabel it, of course, label it sketch, and then drop the opacity, and that way you can still look at it. So here it is right here. So let's go next into our process. We're going to work on the terrain, okay? So with terrain, it's not complex. Now that I've got that sketch there, I kind of know where I'm going to be putting cliffs or hills or whatever I'm going to be using to show elevation. So I'll go over to my terrain. I'm going to go ahead and turn my terrain on. And the way that I put it together was really simple. All I did was just take these sections are called hills, and they have a clipping mask. I turned off the clipping mask because I didn't want to use them. If you're not familiar with what a clipping mask is, it's basically a stamp that picks up whatever is on the FG layer. Anything in the FG layer is basically anything made with the add mode of the mask tool, okay? So with that FG layer, it's going to pick up whatever texture is beneath it. This is great for overlapping something that you want to hide, and that way you can just paint over it, okay? So clipping masks are great, and we'll go more into depth of those in a moment. But what I did is, all I did was just take each one of those cliff pieces and just pieced them together going like this until the whole thing was following that sketch that I used, right? So there was no confusion about where the cliff stamps go because I have a guide to help me out. That's why it's so important to have some kind of reference image or a sketch. You know, you want to draw it by hand and then import it as a custom stamp and then lay it down over the map. You can do that too. Whatever your reference is for a sketch is going to be helpful. Trust me, okay? So now that I've kind of put all that together, I can go ahead and turn off that sketch. For now, I don't really need it, but we're going to kind of focus in on the terrain. I want you to notice a couple things that were done. I took that hill stamp and I changed the blend mode to luminosity. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, you're going to see over here, there's going to say blend modes. And there's a blend mode at the very bottom called luminosity. Luminosity just means it's going to pick up whatever texture or whatever kind of color is beneath it, it will pick it up. So this way, those lines didn't look too dark, the line work of those cliffs, and they kind of match the same color of whatever texture is beneath it. There is one caveat though when using luminosity. You sometimes have to change the brightness or the darkness of a stamp so that it isn't too dark or too bright. It picks up the color, but not necessarily the value, as in how dark and how bright it is, okay? That you might have to adjust yourself. So just keep that in mind, okay? Also notice one other thing too, and that is that I put little tiny rocks. And what's really nice to show more reality with your terrain is to show erosion, right? You would expect some rocks and some bits and some debris to be at the base of where those cliffs are because that represents debris. It gives it a sense of realism. So it's nice to have some fallen rocks on the bottom of those cliffs or hills or whatever it is, so that way it makes it look a little bit more realistic, okay? All right, so let's go back into our process and let's keep going and see what we have next. Next line up. We want to focus on the next part, which is that access, which is part of the terrain. So I'll go ahead and click access, and I'm going to turn this on, and you're going to notice a couple things. There needs to be a way to get up to the fort, right? And so there are technically 4 access points. The first one's at the top here, but there's nothing really going on. There's no real need to show anything outside of a road. But right here is that first gate. Nothing special with the terrain, just flat. But what about if there is a cliff right next to the cliff? Or I have a gate right next to the cliff right there. I've used kind of this hell stamp that I have found. It looks like it's meant to be like flowing, cooled magma, but it works great as like a terrain step because currently we don't have any kind of natural looking steps. So go into that hell pack and check that out. And of course I use the luminosity blend mode because the hell stamp, it looks all dark, kind of red with gray. That doesn't match with the terrain beneath, the texture beneath. So change that blend mode. And then also I have some terrain right here, these kind of natural looking steps leading to the swamp. And remember that swamp is a great defensive part. Troops are not going to mobilize in that swamp, so that way to getting into the fort is not going to be very helpful. Now the last one over on this east side right here, I've used another one of those hell stamps and I just changed it to luminosity blend mode, and it acts as kind of a natural land bridge that you can go across. Okay, so those are our access points. You'll also notice that there are some textures that have some of the roads where all of our buildings will be and stuff like that. And we'll get into texturing. So if you're saying, well, how did you come up with all this texturing? Don't worry, we're going to cover that in depth. So don't you worry, okay? All right, so now that I've kind of added in those access points, we can kind of move on to our next part, which is we want to maybe touch base on some vegetation. Okay. Also, I'm not a historian, so if you have any Roman history or any kind of information that you want to share in the chat, be my guest. We love learning here. I love learning. If you like history, you like Roman history in specific, feel free to share that in the chat. I love that stuff. I love learning. So let's go ahead and work on kind of that next step here. We're going to want to put in some vegetation, and I'm not putting in much vegetation. If you're around a fort, much of the trees have been cut down. They've been cut because they're going to be used for wood for building, right? So if you'll notice, I put a lot of stumps down in kind of that open terrain to kind of show that, yeah, there was a lot of trees that were once here, and they were all cut down to act as resources for construction. So that's one thing. And I also added in a couple ferns at the bottom of the swamp to give it some vegetation. Wherever you have water, you have a lot of vegetation. So because there's a swamp, lots of vegetation. Access to water means a lot for plants so that they can survive. So swamp, add in some swamp ferns or whatever kind of stamp that you want to use, okay, for vegetation. Okay, let's keep going here. And let's go into our curtain walls. That's going to be the main walls that surround the fort. And I'll show you how to put these together because making a wall can seem kind of confusing. So I'll show you how I go about doing this. I'm going to first open it up and then I'll do a little demo on how I made the fort. So it can be kind of confusing. So let's just put it together. I'll open it up and we're going to go ahead and I'll show you how I piece this together. Okay, but this is our Roman, this is where our curtain wall is. And I'm going to show you how I put it all together. So let's just go into the catalog, and there's something a really cool stamp set in the catalog under Castle Pack. So if you open up the catalog, press the F key if you just want to go right into that catalog, or click that little thumbnail right there. Go ahead into the left panel and you'll see a section called Castle. Click that pack. Okay. Now, a little secret is if you know the name of something, but you don't know what it is, if you go up to this little hamburger menu in the top right-hand corner, there's a little thing called Show Names, okay? Once the names are shown, it's so much easier to find stuff. So really nice to remember that little trick right there, the hamburger menu in the right corner, hide or show name. So that way you can see the name of everything, and that way you also remember it, the name of it as well. Sometimes you don't want to scroll for 30 minutes in our massive catalog to find a stamp. If you know the name of it, you can type it into the search field at the top. So super important that you do that. Now in the castle, there are these castle wall composites. These are fantastic. I love these things. These are absolutely useful. So I'm going to scale it down really small, but I'm going to show you the trick that I use for putting together these walls. Let's make them real small because we have a little bit of room to work with here. What you do first is you place down one stamp, okay? The way that you put together a castle or fortifications or a structure is you start with one segment at a time and then you connect them, especially with this castle, okay? Once you've placed down that stamp, then you want to go back into that catalog and you want to look up clipping masks, okay? Clipping masks are a must. We talked a little bit about them earlier. We do have a whole video on that. Go to our YouTube, go look for understanding clipping masks. It's in there. It'll totally help you with it, okay? So let's type in clipping or clip. There's supposed to be an I in there somewhere, but hey, just type in clip. Might take a moment for it to load, so just give it a moment. And we're going to go ahead and put a clipping mask underneath the stamp because what we want is, if you look carefully, I can see I can see stuff underneath it. Let me click this piece right here. If I was to put this down right here, you notice I can see the stumps beneath that castle section. That's no bueno. That's not going to help, okay? So we'll put a clipping mask beneath that so that way it's not going to show us any stamps beneath it. So take a clipping mask, make sure it's a layer below the castle section, and just place it down. And now I'm going to go ahead and just scale it to where it matches up to the whole section like this. Make sure it's not bleeding outside of the wall. You can copy and paste, add another section if you want. And let's go ahead and what's really nice is that when you have a stamp that's at 0 degrees, these little white hot bars will pop up. And this will allow you to transform whatever stamp that is. But remember, the caveat is that it must be at 0 degrees. That's a big, important thing. So let me go ahead and just scale this or move this a little bit more to make sure that the clipping mask is covering the whole thing. Then I'm just push this. And once you've done that, you're going to copy and paste it. I'm going to flip it. You can hold down Control or Shift. I can't remember whichever device that you might be using. I'm using a Mac with a Windows keypad or keyboard. So you could also, if you're not sure about shortcuts, you can see shortcuts right here. Show shortcuts here. And I think you can also press the K key, I think, for those to show up. Let me double check. Yeah, K key. So that way they pop up. Now you want to select all the clipping masks and the castle itself. Okay, now you have one piece here. Let's say that I wanted to make a square fort. Okay, once it's been grouped, you want to label it too, call it something like castle. If you go to that right panel and click that little pencil right there, it'll say rename. And we're just going to call it castle corner, okay? And then you can copy and paste it and then rotate it again. And we're gonna line up the pieces like this. Oopsie, a little too much rotation there, naughty. Okay, you line them up. And then of course you would take that whole thing, those two pieces, copy, paste, rotate them, and then you would have that last section. So if I take this, let's scale it down a little bit more. I mean, you get the general idea, right? So that's how you put your pieces together. And of course, when I drag over a stump, notice that, hey, oh, wait a minute, it needs to be above, by the way. Always make sure that's a layer above. Let's go, keep going up a little bit. There we go. See, now with set to a higher layer than the stump, it goes over that. See, that's really, really helpful when you want to make walls or a platform of some kind for your battle map, so that way you're not picking up anything under, no stamps underneath it, but you want to maintain or recolor it, because those clipping masks means you can texture any way you want. So those pieces right there, I can go in and just take whatever texture that I want, set to FG. Remember, clipping masks are on the FG layer, and I can make this whole thing whatever texture that I want. See how it's only painting on the FG layer? Those are those clipping masks. Okay, so very, very, very helpful. Now you know how to put them together. Not complex, pretty easy stuff, right? So very cool, very, very helpful. Okay, all right, let's go ahead and take a look at our next step. So we put together that curtain wall. Now we want to put together the structures. And I know you see some details are on top of the walls. We'll go over that. And I do want to mention just two other things real quick about the curtain wall. One thing you'll notice is that I've painted these towers to be slightly lighter than the wall segments below them. Contrast is the trick to showing height. If you want to show a section being higher than another, then use the same texture but lighter. So this piece right here and this piece right here have the exact same texture, but I've darkened the texture in this area by just using the brightness slider and bringing it down to make it a little bit darker. So that way it looks like these tower sections are higher up than the adjacent wall connecting wall pieces. So contrast is a big deal. When it comes to details on your walls, you'll also want to consider things about what would be at the top of a gatehouse. There would be maybe buckets or barrels of oil. You might have some kind of defensive equipment like a scorpion or whatever kind of siege weapon that you want or to protect from sieges. And the other thing that I want to mention is there also needs to be access to get into the fort. So on each side of the fort, I've created this access point, and I've used stairs, clipping masks, and a landing. If you want to know more about stairs, definitely head over to our YouTube channel and look up how to create stairs. It's a great beginning tutorial. It breaks down the whole caboodle about staircases. Super duper helpful. I definitely recommend that you check that out, okay? So make sure that there is access. So notice that I have one of those staircases on each section of the wall so that soldiers can access those ramparts, okay, those sections. So that's important. So now we're going to make the structures inside, okay? And this stuff is easy, okay? Now, we also want to think about the buildings that I'm going to have in it. And really, this is going to be determined by just how much room that you have, okay? So I have barracks. If you're not sure what a barrack is a place that houses soldiers. And within the Roman Empire and their soldiery, there is a lot of different clarifications of soldiers. So there might be different types of houses or different types of housing for each type of soldier within the Roman Empire. So I've got 4 buildings representing the barracks with each different type of soldiery type. There's also a praetorium, which is basically the camp of the praetor, or the main general who's in charge of the military campaign or in charge of the fort. He has a command over that fort, so that's going to be their main tent. There's also going to be the Principia. Now, historically, the Principia would be in the center of the Roman fort, but I'm doing a different design, and that's the beauty of it, is you don't have to follow history perfectly. D&D is all about fantasy, so I put the Principia in the top here on the left side or west side of the fort, and the Principia is basically the principal building, okay? It's where maybe the soldiers go to meet, maybe there'll be some temple services there. It is the principal building, so you want to make sure that you do some decorations around that structure to show that that's an important building, right? And then there's also several other buildings as well. There's a granary, and there's some stables. Actually, those are supposed to be reversed. This one right here is supposed to be the stable, and this one is the granary. Oops, my bad there. I think I might have labeled them wrong there. Okay, now when you're putting together roofs, I definitely recommend that you go check out our How to Create Roofs stream on YouTube. It goes into depth, but the basic breakdown is really simple. In the catalog, you can find some composite roof pieces that have already been put together. So if I just go into that search field, type in roof, some roof segments are going to pop up. Notice that there are some segments that have already been put together for you. These are great. These are going to act as your base. I used rectangular marble roofs for this one. And they come in a variety of shapes that you can work with. And then you'll choose, when you're making a roof, the basics are pretty simple. Start with the largest piece first, the large roof piece. After you've put the roof piece on, establish if there's a fireplace that you want to put down. Establish that there are dormers. A dormer is basically a window section on the roof. Those pieces right there are what's referred to as a dormer, okay? And if the building is multiple floors, definitely add in some dormers, okay? Dormers are going to be super helpful, okay? Then, of course, after you've done that, you want to designate the access, how to get in. I've made this one, this Principia right here, or that principal building. I've made sure to show some trees and to show some stairs as well, kind of sticking out to show that this is kind of an important building. It is called the Principia, right? The principal building. So important. Another thing that you can do to establish what kind of a building is, when your players are running around, they might not know what a building is. The details on the outside of the building tell the story for you. So this building right here is going to be a granary. So I've made sure to add some important things in here, some important things in this building right here, like maybe some crates of grain. So I know that's a granary, maybe some barrels here. Some barrels or crates are a great way to add some details, right? Like, how do I know what this building is over here? It's a stable because I've got some hay here for horses or whatever livestock is in the stable for them to eat. So details are how you determine what a building is, because your players might not want to go in the building. They might be unaware what the building is. So adding in the details on the exterior are a great way to emphasize what a building is. Okay? So those are going to be our structures. Now, once I've kind of put those structures together, I want to put some more emphasis now on elevation and height. So the way that I go about doing that is using shadows. So I'll start with the terrain shadows first. And shadowing is not complex, okay? Shadowing is a couple things you can do. You can use a black color and just drop the opacity and make sure that softness is all the way up to 100 or 1. It's really important because when you're creating a shadow, you don't want a super hard edge because you might make a mistake. So using a softer brush works a little bit better. There's also using a path. And making a path is pretty simple stuff. You just need to put down a path, set it to black. Make sure the shadow blur intensity is up, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to create a brush or a path that's going to act as a shadow. Once you've picked the color, the shadow, and all that stuff, start to blur until the thickness of the line, the sharp edges of the line completely blur out. Then you can change the opacity, because 100% it might be too dark. So bring it down to whatever opacity you want that to be. Let's go up a little bit so you can see it. And then I can go ahead and put like a shadow. Like let's say there's not much shadow right here. I want to put more. So I'll just go ahead and just put it right there. And of course, if it's too dark, you can just go and change the opacity. Okay, so I can bring the opacity down so that shadow is not so thick, but helpful, right? So very nice to do that. Now we're going to do the same thing probably with the fort, because I want the fort to show height. So I'll go ahead and turn on the shadow. See the huge difference when I turn on and off those shadows? Look what happens. The fort walls seem somewhat flat, right? But as soon as you add that shadow to it, boom, it kind of pops out. So the trick to making things pop out more, again, contrast. So you have a dark shadow or a ambient occlusion, which is a dark drop shadow right along the edge of your stamp so that they pop out. You can use object shadows, layer shadows, you could use paths, you could use textures. It's up to you. That's the great thing about Inkarnate, is there's more than one way to do things. So very, very helpful. Okay, so we got those shadows now. That's nice. Let's keep going into our process. The fort has been put together. We've put the structures. Let's go ahead and put down some textures. And I'm going to show you my method, a process that's really, really helpful for texturing, and I'll show you how to go about doing it. Once you put down some of your stamps first, it gives you an idea of what kind of textures to work with, okay? Now, normally when I start, I work with a series of base textures. The first one I use is just a regular dirt texture. Where it says base, I make sure the entire BG is covered with this dirt texture. Now, the second layer I'll apply after the base has been applied. Think of it as like painting. 1 coat, 2 coat, 3 coat. All right, but the coats are different textures. So the first coat is that base coat. It's going to be dirt. The second coat's going to be this second variation of dirt that looks like it's got some puddles or maybe some wet dirt in that layer 2. And then of course, I also want to have another layer of grass, because what grows on dirt? Grass, right? So those are the base textures. I apply in that order. Dirt, dirt, and then grass. Once you've applied the base textures, and now you can go ahead and move on to throwing down the stamps, you might want to blend together how do I make those cliffs or those hill stamps blend in better? The cracked ground is an alpha texture. In fact, everything in these blending textures is an alpha texture. If you're not familiar with what an alpha texture is, an alpha texture, it has a transparency in it, meaning that only certain artifacts in the stamp will be seen. So with the cracked ground, you'll only see the cracks and crevices. This is a magical texture for applying to where your cliffs are. Notice that I have cracked ground all along the edge here. Notice that there's cracked ground all along here. More cracked ground, cracked ground. See that beautiful cracked ground along that cliff there? That cracked ground is a great way to blend in your terrain stamps, because sometimes it just doesn't look realistic. One of the biggest tricks to blending is to making sure that the stamps blend properly into the textures. Otherwise, it just looks like you put some stickers down on the map and that's it. You want to blend those stamps with the base textures so that way it's seamless in its transition, okay? So, and I've used quite a few other alpha textures, a moss texture, which you can see down here. You can see that dark green texture down there. That's that moss. You'll also notice that I've used a twigs and stones. So there are some twigs right here. Kind of makes sense. Once you chop down a tree and you delimit and start using its timber, you're going to find twigs and sticks everywhere, right? It's just showing the debris of where the cutting of that forest or trees was at, right? So good to have that. I also use this grass right here, and maybe the moss was just too overpowering. So I used this kind of light grass texture just to pop it in randomly, just to kind of give it a little bit more feel to it. It's just, for the more blending you do, the more natural it looks. So throwing in as much of those alpha textures really is going to help to blend. The more blending you do, the more seamless it looks. Finally, I use this dry grass right here. This dry grass stuff is fabulous. I use it a lot to show where sections of the road are. You'll see some dry grass right here and in here. This stuff works magic for showing maybe a section of a road or where people have been trampling. I use it all the time. It's in the Orc pack, so go check out your dry grass. Absolutely fantastic. Love that stuff. And with the marsh, I didn't do much. I just used that greenish looking water texture, and then I used a white phthalo to kind of represent maybe light glistening or reflecting off whatever's water is in that marsh. So process is simple. Base texture first. Once the stamps are down, use alphas and whatever textures you want for blending. Okay, so it's not complex. It's very, very easy. Hey, first time chatter. Hey, Abe, welcome. Really glad that you're here. So texturing, not complex. And I do hope to make a video in the future kind of covering textures more in depth for those of you who just really need a texture guide on how to put that together, okay? So texturing, not complex, much easier than you think, okay? It's all about the transition between stamp and base texture. That's it. And I know that's like, oh, how can you say that? Just practice, and believe me, it will help you. So now that we finished texturing, we're going to go ahead and do some interiors, okay? Making an interior is super important. So what happens if you don't have any room to do your interior? Don't worry about that. What's really nice is that you can resize. Let's just say this is the map right here, but I have no room to put interiors. I guess you could put some interiors in this little bottom corner here, but I'm leaving that open so that more combat can take place there. And so you would just resize it and just add a section to the left, right, bottom, or whatever that would have some space for you to put down some interiors. And I like to use a black background so that way the focus is purely on the interior, and also to have those areas each interior separated from each other, so that way when you put it in the VTT you don't accidentally see something else. For instance, this might be too close, these two things. But as an overall rule, if you're working with VTT, try to put them to where they're separate from each other so that you can't see any other section of the map. It's kind of a general rule of thumb for those of you who are using a VTT. Black background. The base floor, by the way, could have some texturing underneath it if you want to. That's up to you. But for me, I'm just going to go about doing it this way. So let's go ahead and open up our interiors, and we'll kind of go over how to make interiors. So we'll start first with our Principia, the principal building. And we'll go ahead and just pull up a path here so that I can kind of select some stuff. You kind of see what I'm working with here. Okay, there we go. Excellent. Let's turn off that shadow. All right, excellent. So inside the Principia, I've kind of made a open area so that people can come together and discuss things. Maybe that's where you celebrate. Maybe that's where feasting is. And so there are some important things when you are making your interiors. That first one is the access. Make sure that the access points are lined up with the exterior. So notice this is with the Principia building right here. Notice where the stairs are, okay? And notice where the chimney is, okay? These are really important things. Try to remember where the chimney is. Try to remember where the staircases is, because when you make the interior, you want to make sure that they're lined up properly. I have my chimney right here with a fireplace to keep this building warm, and the staircases that lead into it. And of course, I've added some other things as well. I've added in these pillars right here. These pillars are super nice. I think they're kind of useful, and it kind of shows that these are the supports for that building. So just use that same wall. And I want to mention something really important, by the way, about putting together your rooms. And that secret is contrast, okay? Normally what I do is you want your walls to be brighter. When you're piecing together your walls, you want the walls to be brighter while the ground texture is going to be darker, okay? That will help to make the walls pop out more because they're so much brighter. And then also don't forget to apply either some kind of shadow, some kind of drop shadow, whether you want to use layer, otherwise you want to use the layer shadows, works great for walls, or you want to use a texture, or if you want to use a path. I used a path for this one in particular myself, but that's great. And then I used the segment right here and made a heavy drop shadow on the object so that way that would pop out. Okay, now some other details in the Principia is like some rugs to give it a more regal or a more important feel to it, like the function of this building is important. And I've thrown in some greenery. I can't tell you how important it is to throw in a little bit of greenery in your buildings, okay? It makes it so much more realistic when you throw down some greenery inside of a building, whether it's a potted plant, whether it's some vines growing in a ruin, whether there's a tree growing in a ruin somewhere, or whatever it might be, okay? But adding a little bit of greenery is really gonna make that pop out. So super important, okay? Let's also cover the Praetorium. That's that building right here. Remember, mark where the chimney is and wherever windows might be, just in case you want to show some light coming in through the windows. And the Praetorium is the commander's tent. So expect a little bit more opulence maybe with this one. Okay, so I've made sure to throw in some interesting things. One of the first things in the Praetorium is there is kind of a vestibule section. It's kind of a war room where there's a map and a table and some books. This is where maybe the commander and his generals or her generals or their generals, where they come together and hammer out military strategy with the commander, okay? Or maybe there's a private conversation or reprimand of a soldier or some kind of military officer, and that's going to happen within that section, okay? Behind the curtains, though, no, it's not the Wizard of Oz, folks. It's the commander's living arrangement, okay? Think of themselves as having their own fireplace. They're going to have a little bit more luxury, a nice fireplace. They've maybe got some food on demand right there. They've also got the greenery, like I mentioned in the previous building. They have a nice, comfortable bed, right? So some things when you think about doing the interior of a building, just think first of the function of the building. That's the trick, okay? If you don't know what to put inside of a building, just remember its function. If it's a granary, put grain in it, right? Put some food, put in a grindstone. These are the things that you want to put in. So details are determined by the function of the building, okay? And I've also put a rug in there and a chair. So there's a lot of cool things in there for that commander or praetor so that they kind of live a little bit more luxury. Let's go ahead and touch base on the other elongated buildings or the longer rectangular buildings. The other one is a granary. Okay, and I even tried to follow kind of a diagram I saw about Roman granaries, but it's basically like a pit right here. And what I did is I used a well, and then I took a clipping mask and put it on top of the open part of the well. And then I used clipping masks right here as well, okay, to hide that section of the well that connects right here. Used 2 concrete walls to make a V shape. And then I painted in a hay texture, okay? So not complex, but that's where the grain gets processed. People go in there, they use maybe some massive kind of pestle, and they're just, or mortar and pestle. It's like, think of it as a massive mortar and pestle, okay? Where they're going in and hammering away at that grain, okay? There's also let's also put in a fireplace where they can maybe ferment, maybe they want to make beer, maybe they want to cook some food there. It's nice to have that there. And of course, a storage area as well, okay? Remember that trick. Remember the trick. What defines the details within a building is the function of the building. So that granary is in there. Let's also touch base on the stables. Just so you know, you don't have to add in horses. If you're using a VTT, yes, bread, absolutely, Abe. Absolutely, I agree with you, bread. With a stable, you don't have to add in the horses. If you're doing VTT, very clearly, you probably won't put the horses in because you'll probably have a token that's going to act as the horse, but I'm just throwing it in for scale so you can kind of see it. First, of course, when you're making any kind of stable, you're going to want to create the horse bins or the stalls, basically, where the horses are going to sit. There's 3 horses here. It could be a lot larger if you wanted to. I'm just going with 3 for right now. The only people who really had horses would have been cavalry or commanders or people in charge. Most of the auxiliaries, legionaries, tribuni, and others would not have horses, and the Romans were not known for using their cavalry very often. It just wasn't something they used very often. It was usually an elite group that never actually went into combat, but they had horses anyway. Horses is a sign of wealth, and you have money to afford a horse. Okay, people who are not wealthy, like soldiers, they would not have been rich. Only the commanders, only they would have had the horses. So you don't need to have a massive amount of horses in these stalls. 3 is just fine for some of the commanders. Maybe some of the tribuni have one, or maybe the praetor has one. So you don't need a whole lot. Okay, so just have that there. The details are hay for them to eat. Maybe throw in a bucket, a bin for water, whatever. I didn't throw everything in there, but you can do as many details as you want. I put in a wheelbarrow. I probably would put in this top corner here maybe a place for water trough so that they could eat. Buttons, I don't think auxiliaries had horses, but I'm not a historian, so don't quote me on this. It's just the stuff that I've read up on. So go check it out. Let me know. I love learning. So any Roman history you have under your belt, feel free to share that with me because I don't mind. I love it. Okay. So let's go ahead and open up the barracks now. And there are 4 barrack buildings, and these buildings are somewhat taller. So really what I'm trying to portray here is a series of bunk beds. So really there's probably about 10 or 15, maybe 20 people that stay inside of each one of these buildings. But there's your auxiliaries, which would have been basically non-citizens who would have been like maybe slaves who would have acted as kind of soldiers. You had your legionaries, which is your regulars, who were actually Roman soldiers. They were Roman citizens, so they would actually have citizenship. And then you would also have your tribuni, which would have been basically tribunes, which in the concept of Roman history, a tribune was pretty much a orator for the people. They spoke for the people. They would act as like an overseer, or they kind of overlook. They have a lot of more function. It changed throughout the Roman Empire, whether it was a republic or history. There's actually a lot to Roman history, so it's not really fair to make a blanket statement, but tribuni would have been one form of soldiery that would have been in the military camp, and finally some cavalry. Okay, and I could have actually put in nicer beds in here. I didn't, and I should have, because cavalry would have come from probably more noble stock in the Roman Empire, but you don't have to do that. Normally barracks are pretty cheaply built materials, cheap made buildings, so you don't have to actually add a lot of detail to a barrack. Again, like I said, cavalry might be an exception to that, maybe tribuni as well. But for now, I just kept it simple. All right. Let's go ahead and go with that last kind of process. Go check out where that process is. And I think that last bits are going to be pretty much filters. Okay. So with horses, or I'm sorry, horses, I'm reading the chat and trying to do this at the same time. Please forgive me, folks. All right, let's go ahead and move the process out of the way. And when it comes to filters, it really depends on the mood that you're going for, okay? And, there are a couple ones that you could just use right off the bat. Is there a video on clipping masks? There absolutely is. I think it might be actually already mentioned in the chat. Just go up. I think it might be there. If not, then definitely just go to the YouTube channel that we have and just click in clipping masks Inkarnate and it shall pop up for you. All right, so with filters, a couple filters that you can use. I'm going to go ahead and use 2 in particular. My first one's going to be kind of clarity. And the reason why I choose clarity, because clarity just makes things pop out more. I really, 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 really like clarity a lot. It's a fantastic kind of filter to use. It kind of makes things pop out. Let me turn it off real quick and you'll see the difference. Just give it a sec. See how it's a little bit duller, not quite as bright. Turn the clarity on, pops out a bit more, right? And I'm also going to throw down a color filter. If you're not familiar, if you don't know what filters to put down, the first one is clarity, and then maybe adding in a color filter, red sky, winter, whatever it is you want. And that's just going to give a little bit more red to the map so that everything has a reddish tint to it. And actually, I forgot to mention one last thing, and that was palisade walls, which is great. If you're doing a kind of a siege for this map, then you're probably putting some palisade walls both within the fort in the certain street areas as well as in front of the gate, these palisade walls. The objective of a palisade wall is to hinder movement, okay, or to hinder vision of something, all right? That's what palisade walls, it's a defensive measure. It's very important to use palisade walls. You can use them both within the fort or outside of the fort. Totally up to you whether or not you want to do that. I put one here on the north exit or entrance, and I've also put some on this island right here, this land island right here, this spot right here. And of course, there are other filters that you could use, by the way. We'll jump back into filters here. A lot of different filters that you can use, vignettes, spotlights. It just depends on what the battle map is. Sometimes you don't know what the mood will be, so play around with filters and then you'll be like, oh, I kind of like that. So palisade walls, great. Use filters, very, very helpful. Oh yeah, a fantasy stronghold sounds great. We'll definitely throw that in there. I'm only just making this Roman one because I want people to, I want to throw in a little bit of history, but also it's awesome to have, you know, base your forts, your castles off of real castles, real forts, because it's a little bit more realistic for yourself. So basing this fort off a Roman fort is a great way to get an idea with history, but to also have this awesome fort that you can now use. And I'll make sure that this map is clonable so that you, if you want to use this giant, freaking massive battle map, you totally can. It'll be on the profile. But that pretty much covers it, okay? The process really, really, really helps, okay? You follow that process. Doesn't have to be in perfect order. You can go back and forth, and I'm always refining my process as well as I go along. The better and better you get, the more and more your process changes. Just like your skill changes, your process changes. Change is a good thing. Change is good. So don't be afraid to change. Practice. And definitely discover, try new things, and you can always reach out on our Discord server to a mentor or to myself on Discord if you're looking for help with your maps, okay? Kind of hoping that sometime in the future I'll be able to go into Discord chat and help people out, I think maybe once a week or so, to kind of just help people with their map, because, you know, what's really helpful is getting feedback from the community, and we have a great community on Discord. Everyone is super nice. Well, hey, that is the end of the stream. I hope you liked it. We do have more castle streams moving forward. I think the next one is going to be, I can't remember the name of the fort, I forgot what it was, but we're going to be doing that next month. So lots of fun. I believe the next stream next week is going to be how to create parchment maps, and we're going to be focusing a lot on texturing and how to work clipping masks and how to put a parchment map together. So that'll be next Wednesday, 3 p.m. PST. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you all to all of you who showed up today. Thank you all you new first-time chatters who showed up. So glad to have you here. Don't forget to follow us here on Twitch. Go to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much. Love you all. I'll see you all next week. Merry map making and a viaze, my friends.